What is going on? This is Ryan with Automatic Comics, and there has been a lot of interest in the census lately. A lot of talk about the CGC census, how many books are out there for each of these key books, how many books are being added to the census, what's the potential impact on values, all this kind of stuff. And so I thought I would put together a video where we do a comparison of the different eras. So we've got modern, we've got copper, we've got bronze, we've got silver, and we've got golden age. And so what I did was I just picked five, what I'll call them key or popular books from each era, ranging across the era. That's what I tried to do, like picking from different time periods across the era. And I looked at the total counts for those books. I looked at how many were added in approximately the last year. We do a comparison to really see how many are being added in each of these eras, how stable each of these eras are. I think it's pretty interesting. I think it's pretty interesting. It really gives you a good view of how many of these books are out there and how many are being added and how much you can expect the census to grow over time. And that should be something that you should really care about with the values of your books. Now, I have said in the past that I don't think the census is everything, because there are some issues with it. For example, like people will send books in for regrades. They'll try to bump a 9.6 to a 9.8 or a 5 to a 5.5 or whatever. And they often won't send the label back in. The census might sometimes appear that it's growing, but it's not. And there's no way for us to really know. So we just have to take it at its face value and just know that some percentage of those books out there are not real. They're phantom books on the census. So we're going to go through each of these. We'll talk about each of these books. Then we'll do kind of a recap at the end where we look at it all together and see how those different eras compare to each other. Let's check this out. All right, so before we get started, please remember to hit that like button and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this. So I really don't want to see any comments where someone's telling me like, oh, you didn't pick this book, or you didn't pick this book, or you didn't do enough books for, and it's like, this took a long time to put together. Doing 5 books per era already took a long time to put together. I might not get hardly any views. So I put as much time as I felt I could into this. If you would like to check more books, you are more than welcome to do that. But I felt like this was enough to at least give us a decent idea about those different eras, how things change, how many books you might normally see across keys in those different eras. Because what I really wanted to focus on, you want to focus on keys. You want to focus on books that have a pretty decent amount of value, because those are the books people are going to send in to get graded. You can have books that appear rare and people just don't send them in because they don't have a lot of value. But if you have books that have value, people will send them in to get graded and give you a good picture. But we're going to start with modern age. We'll start with modern. We'll work back to the golden age. And the way I got this data is I used a combination of the CGC data website. I also use Go Collect, and with Go Collect, we can at least see some images and things, so we're not just looking at numbers all the time. But first one here, X-Men #1, one of the most printed books of all time. And there's a bunch of covers, but they all get combined into the same grade. So you can see here, there are 16,438 universals, and that's what we're going to be talking about here. We're focusing specifically on universals. It's just the simplest way to go through this, not getting into restoration and signature copies and all of that. So we're talking about the universals, 16,438. So if I go to CGC data and look up X-Men #1, the closest I can do going back a year is June 27th of last year. So if you really wanted to multiply these numbers by like 1.1, you could do that, and that would get you probably a good estimate for the year, or 1.09, but this is going to be close enough for what we're doing. So for all of these, we're going back to June 27th of 2023. And you can see that X-Men #1 in that time period added 2,408 copies. And so that is a huge jump in 1 year, or technically like 11 months. That is a 17% increase in copies in that time period. So people love X-Men #1. People have tons of copies of X-Men #1, very high grade copies of X-Men #1. Because you can see, of those 2,408, 1,339 were 9.8s. So And I'm going to try to move through these relatively quick because we've got a lot of books to talk about. But that's the first one. The next one that we are going to talk about is Amazing Spider-Man number 361. So we've got the first appearance of Carnage, a character that is extremely popular. Spider-Man stuff, always popular. I mean, look at that census right now. 27,352 universals. Got 399s. I bet that's going to change. I bet there's going to be a lot more of those coming out. But 27,352. Then if we go to the CGC data site, you can see that in the last year, they have added 1,732 copies. 426 98s, no 99s added in the last year. But we'll see. We'll see. But that is an increase of 7%. So we had a 7% increase in Amazing Spider-Man 361 copies on the census. All right, now the next one that we are going to talk about. So we're moving up a little bit, a jump, in the years a little bit. We're going to move up to NYX number 3. So this is the first appearance of X-23. This is one that was the early 2000s that I thought would probably have a decent number of copies that get submitted because it's a pretty high dollar book. You've got 6,276 universals, 599s for this one. So if you look in the last year, they added 369 copies to the census. So an increase of 6%. So a 6% increase. Now, one of the things I often like to think about, if you look at this like investing, it doesn't totally work like this because it's not compound interest with these. It actually gets a little harder to add more as time goes on. But there's something called the rule of 72. If you divide that number by 72 by that number, it gets approximately how long it would take to double that census. And so at 6%, that would be 12 years about to double the census. So just something to think about there. Those are types of numbers you can look at, like 17% and be like 4 years. I mean, if you're adding 2,400 copies each time, but now granted, I think that these numbers would probably decrease each year, not increase like you would get with an investment. So it's not going to be a perfect match, but just gives you a little bit of an idea. But 369 new copies of NYX number 3. Next one is Ultimate Fallout number 4. I mean, we got to include this one. The book that has 0 99s right now. But I think they're not sure when they want to add that new 99. I mean, I know they're talking about it, but once they do, I bet the floodgates are just going to break and there's going to be just tons of them. I mean, we got 4,300 98s, 0 99s, 16,483 copies on census. And in the last year, we added 1,189 because we're looking just at the first print, the cover A first print, 1,189. That is an increase of 8% for Ultimate Fallout 4. Then the last one that we're going to talk about is Edge of Spider-Verse number 2. First appearance of Spider-Gwen, another major book from this era. This is from 2014. So like I said, I'm trying to pick books that span out through these, these different years in this era that are also popular. So you're going to have a lot of submissions. And so 7,369 universals. This one added 634 in the last year, which is a 9% increase. So if we look at all these together, you can just see these all compared to one another, and you get an idea how many books are on the census for books of this era, what the increases are like. And so you can see for modern age, from 1991 until now, you generally have thousands to tens of thousands of copies on the census for those key issues. Now, if it's a run filler book, you're not going to have as many, but for these key issues, thousands to tens of thousands. And you can see the increases anywhere from around 6% up to 17%. And definitely seems like it gets bigger the closer you get to copper almost in some cases, but 6% up to 17%. So this is the first one. This is the first era that we're looking at. So now let's move on to the Copper Age. So we're going to start with Secret Wars number 8. So Secret Wars number 8, one of the most graded books on the census. There are 26,189 universals, 4 10-0s, 23 99s. This one added an astounding number in the last year. Oh my God. This one added 3,105 copies. That is a 13% increase in graded copies in the last year, technically 11 months. That is a big number. Like, that's the type of thing where you just go, that could definitely have an impact on values, especially when you're talking about the high grades. Like with these types of books, like the mid and lower grades, I mean, it's like $100-ish book, more or less. But when you get to the high grades where you get those value differences, it's going to definitely have a measurable impact. All right. Now, the next one we're going to talk about, moving up to 1988, we're going to go to Incredible Hulk number 340. So this classic McFarlane cover, super popular cover. I mean, one of the best covers from this era. You know, you got Wolverine on the cover, you've got the Hulk reflecting in his claws. 11,079 copies on Census, Universal. In the last year, this one added 1,260. Also 13%. Same as Secret Wars 8. Another huge jump for this book, and a lot of high grade copies. I mean, 148 9/8s, 216 9/6s, 226 9/4s. I mean, a lot of high grade copies of that book. All right, now the next one, the most graded book on the Census, Amazing Spider-Man number 300. We're sticking in 1988 for this one. I just felt like this had to be part of this discussion. I mean, you got the most graded book on the Census, one of the most popular books of all time, first appearance of Venom, or first full appearance of Venom, but 29,489 copies on Census. I mean, just a ton of them. 10 9/9s, 1,600 9/8s. This one had an increase of 2,268 copies in the last year. You can see that right here. Spider-Man 300, 2,268 copies, a bunch of 9/8s, 165, no 9/9s yet added this year. 297 9/6s. I mean, a lot of them. This is an 8% increase for this book. All right, then we're going to jump to Remember It, Uncanny X-Men, number 266, first full appearance of Gambit, whatever you want to call it. You can claim the annual, but nobody wants that annual. Everybody wants this book. They want that first cover appearance of Gambit. Another book that has a ton of copies on Census. 1990, 21,618 copies on Census. In the last year, added 1,821 copies. That is an increase of 9%. I mean, again, like these are some pretty big numbers in the copper age. We've had 13, 13, 8, and 9. All right, now the last one we're going to talk about for copper. I was actually surprised that this one wasn't higher, that there hadn't been more copies added in the last year. This is New Mutants number 98, first appearance of Deadpool. I mean, we've got Deadpool and Wolverine coming out. I was thinking this one would have been more like the Incredible Hulk 340, like a 13% jump. But this one, we've got 25,024 copies on Census, added 1,703 in the last year. You can see here, New Mutants 98, 1,703, just 7%. Actually, the lowest of these 5 books. So 7% for this one. Really, I was expecting more, just with how much demand there is for that book. Now, prices have dropped over the last year or two, so maybe that's something with it, but that's the same with all these books. So I was expecting more from this one, but only added 7%, 1,703. All right, now, when we're looking at the Copper Age, so we've got all these books again together. You can see in the Copper Age, a little different from modern. Like modern, we were in the thousands to tens of thousands for the numbers of books that were graded. Copper, all tens of thousands. There are a lot of these out there. I mean, tons and tons and high grades, and there's a lot of demand for them. That's why they get graded. But I mean, all of them, tens of thousands. The lowest was Incredible Hulk 340 at 11,079, but the rest of these all in the 20s. And then when you look at the percent increase, average is higher than the moderns. I mean, we're seeing a lot of new additions for Copper Age, 13, 13, 8, 9, 7. I mean, big increases in the Census for these Copper Age books. All right, so now we're going to move down to the Bronze Age. So first book from the Bronze Age that we are going to talk about, House of Secrets 92. First appearance of Swamp Thing, 1971, very early Bronze Age key. And so we've got 3,163 on Census, 3 9/8, tough 9/8 for this book. This one added 253 in the last year. Actually, quite a few. 9% increase. And now you can see there are actually some grades where they had drops. Like this one went down 4, which means maybe somebody tried to bump it up, maybe to a 9.2 or a 9.4. Maybe and that's where it can be a little, it can be a little tricky with this stuff. Like you don't know if somebody's actually going to send in those labels or not. But 253 new ones on Census, an increase of 9% for that first appearance Swamp Thing. Great Bernie Wrightson cover. I love that book. That's one that I'd like to try to get a really high grade copy at some point. All right, now the next one, we're going to jump up to 1972. We're going to go with Marvel Spotlight number 5, that first appearance of Ghost Rider. This one doesn't have a very high census, actually. For how popular of a character this is, just 5,483 copies on Census. Not a real high census for this book. This book added 429 in the last year. It's a jump of 8%. Pretty respectable increase in the numbers of copies graded. So jump of 8%, 429. We added that one new 9.8 that I talked about. We added a new 9.8 for this book, 2 new 9.4s. This 9.8 sold for what? I can't remember in that video. It was like 400,000. I mean, the 9.8s are just wild in this book. It is the most expensive Bronze Age book. It's crazy. Marvel Spotlight 5, just because the census is so low. But all right, let's move on to the next one. Jumping up to 1974. We can't not have this book on here. Hulk 181. Now, the reason I don't have Amazing Spider-Man 129 is because I have Hulk 181. I feel like that kind of covers this time frame for a really popular book. 14,342 graded copies, tons of them. That 199 out there that a lot of people think isn't a 99, but whatever. There's 199 out there of it. Incredible Hulk 181, first appearance of Wolverine, added 788 copies last year. 3 new 9.8s, 18 new 9.6s, some high grade copies got added to that census. That was an increase of just 6%. So not a really big jump for this one compared to other numbers that we've seen. Just a 6% increase in the census for Hulk 181. And maybe part of that is this book is already so valuable that people have already been getting the really low grade books graded. But some of the other ones like Marvel Spotlight 5, House of Secrets 92, and when we get into the copper, like the low grade books don't have enough value to justify grading. But as prices go up, people might grade more lower grade books. But this one, just a jump of 6%. Now this one, I had to include this because it's just been, we've been talking about this book so much recently. We got Wolverine limited series number 1, Frank Miller cover, the one that just added technically 11 new 9.9s in the last about month. So this one has 23,248 copies on Census. There was an astounding 2,133 new copies added in the last year. See right here, 2,133 new copies. And like I said, this is just 11 months. So technically for a year, probably a little bit higher. That's an increase of 10%. Pretty big jump. 10% increase for this book in the last year. This is late Bronze Age. For me, I've got Bronze Age up through 1984. It's a late Bronze Age, but let's take a look at one more. This is the 5th book. And this is, I had to have an Amazing Spider-Man book in here. Amazing Spider-Man number 238. That first appearance of the Hobgoblin. This one also has quite a few copies that are graded out there. Because, Spider-Man's a super popular title, so there's going to be a lot of them that were printed, and so a lot of them available. 9,632 copies on Census. 2 9.9s out there. 754 9.8s. I wouldn't be surprised if we get some more 9.9s. But this one added 881 in the last year. That was a jump of 10%. So a 10% increase over last year for Amazing Spider-Man 238, that first appearance of the Hobgoblin. Amazing cover. I think that's such a great cover. I love that one. All right. So now let's take a look at these numbers all together. So we jump down to the Bronze Age. You can see here in the Bronze Age, we're back into the thousands to tens of thousands on the census. So very similar to the modern era. So the modern era had thousands to 10,000s. Bronze Age has thousands to 10,000s. Copper era had all tens of thousands. And you can see the increase went down a little bit from what we saw in the Copper Age. Very similar again to what we saw in the modern age. 8%, 9%, 6%, and a couple tens. All right, now we're moving back, getting older and older here. Now we're going to go back to the Silver Age. We're going to start with showcase number 4. Really one of those books that's considered to have kicked off the Silver Age. Very low census count for this book. Just 433 universals. Very, very low census for these early Silver Age like DCs. This only added 21 copies in the last year. I mean, we're starting to see the difference here. The difference that you can have in these different eras as you get older and older. Only 21 copies. Now, one of the interesting things too is that that's still 5% of the census, but only 21 copies. Only 21 new copies of this book. All right, the next one we're going to look at, jumping up to 1960. A book that used to not be popular, but a lot more demand for this book in the last about 10, 12 years. Tales to Astonish number 13, The First Appearance of Groot. This is a pretty pricey book, and it's tough and high grade too. I mean, you can see here, 194, 192, 585s, very different from what we saw in the bronze, copper, modern era. Now this one just 557 universals, and in the last year, we added 32. So that was a jump of 6%. Pretty similar to the Showcase 4. Jump of 6% for the First Appearance of Groot. All right, now we're jumping up to 1962. Biggest book of the Silver Age has to be in here. Amazing Fantasy, number 15. Actually has a pretty large census. Now the question is, how many of these are real? How many ghost books are on here? Because we know this book gets pressed and resubmitted a lot. But at least from the census, 2,542 copies. And in the last year, we added 94. This is the lowest number we've seen so far percentage-wise. This is just a 4% increase in the last year. And again, this is one that it may be similar to Incredible Hulk 181, how that was the lowest of that group, that this is like the biggest key from this era. And so people will get it graded no matter what the grade is. And so maybe that's just why there are less of them out there. A lot of them have already been graded. And so maybe that's why you're seeing a smaller percentage increase year over year. But just 94 new copies. And I guarantee there are 94 people out there, like new people that don't have one that would love to have an Amazing Fantasy 15. I feel like that demand can be very easily absorbed. But 94 new copies, 4% increase for the First Appearance of Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy 15. All right, now another book that's been getting a lot of attention lately because of some MCU news. Fantastic Four, number 48. First Appearance of Silver Surfer, first called the Cameo Galactus, but it's a cameo like Hulk 180 is a cameo. He's full page on the last panel, says his name, all this kind of stuff. It's not on the cover, so that's something some people don't like. I like the cover for 49 better. Cover for 49 is amazing. You see here, 8,443 universal copies on Census. Fantastic Four 48 added 576. That is a 7% increase. Biggest one so far of the Silver Age, but still generally smaller than all the other eras. So again, we can see some trends here when we go between these different eras. So yes, there are thousands of these, 8,443, only 576 added in the last year, 7%. Now the last one, just because I wanted something just a little bit later, close to the end of the Silver Age, is Silver Surfer number 3. So Silver Surfer number 3, that first appearance of Mephisto, a character that, this got super hot during the comic boom, lots of speculation about this character, and 3,583 on Census, 898s, some high grade copies out there. In the last year, this one added 305 universal copies. The biggest jump of any of these, 9%, but it's also the latest in the era. I don't know how much that goes with it. Like if there are just more out there, if it's a book that wasn't quite as valuable before, it's getting more valuable. So maybe people are more likely to send it in, but a 9% increase for Silver Surfer number 3. Now, if we look at all these again together, we start to see these trends again. Like now the total census is hundreds to thousands, no tens of thousands on here. there might be, maybe there's some book in here in this era that hits the 10,000 mark, but Fantastic Four 48 is going to have a lot of copies graded. So this is probably near the top in the Silver Age, but hundreds to thousands. And you see that percent increase is actually smaller than what we were seeing. Like when you average this out compared to the other eras, 5%, 6%, 4%, 7%, 9%. So on average, smaller for these 5 books that I picked. All right, now, finally, moving on to the Golden Age. So which books are we going to talk about for the Golden Age? You got to start with Action Comics #1. Action Comics #1, 44 universal copies on Census. Not a lot of these. 79 total, but 44 universals. You know how many universals were added in the last year? 0. 0 new universals, just 3 restored copies. A 6, a 5, 5, and a 5. Just 3 restored copies. So technically, from the metrics we're using here, we're just talking about universals. 0 new copies of Action Comics #1. 1938 kicks off the Golden Age. This is what we're talking about when we get back to this type of era. Like this census is a little bit more stable than some of the other eras, but not all of them, not all the books in this era. Well, and we'll talk about that. So the next one we're going to go to, because this one gets a lot of flack, partially from me, because it comes up for sale so often, it feels like there's just a ton of them. But it's Batman #1. I mean, even in this upcoming Heritage auction, there are, is it 4? It's 3 or 4 copies of Batman #1. I mean, it just always feels like there's just a ton of them that are being sold. We kind of feel like it's just dealers like selling to each other or something. I don't know, but it's like every major auction seems to have Batman #1 in it. But 146 universals in the last year, we had 3 new universals added. We had 8 restored. So, but we're just talking about the universals. So 3 new universals. So out of 146 total, that is an increase of 2%. So yeah, it's an increase. But when we're looking at these numbers compared to the other eras, especially the earlier stuff here, like getting back early 40s, the 30s, this census does not change all that much, especially when you're talking about universal copies. All right, now the next one, I brought this one in just because it's a book that's very interesting to me. And it's one of these where it's going to be a little bit more obscure, and you can kind of see how often you might see these books pop up. And this is Punch Comics #12. That classic skull cover by Gus Rica. It's a crime / horror type cover because you got the skull, but it's also kind of like a crime scene. Just 32 universal copies on Census. Again, we had 1 restored copy added this year. 0 universals. And so, I mean, these are these books that are tough. Like, they're tough. They do not, like, new copies do not surface very often. Now, you might hear about things like these big collections that get found, that become pedigrees and that kind of stuff, but those are rare occurrences at that level that include this type of book. And so Punch Comics #12, 0 new copies in the last year. And the next one, we're going to jump up a few more years. We did 1938 for Action 1, 1940 for Batman 1, 1945 for Punch 12, and now we're going to do Detective Comics #140 for 1948. This is the first appearance of the Riddler on the cover too. That's one of the things that makes this book especially desirable, is that it's a first appearance in the Golden Age of a villain, and that villain is on the cover. So 192 copies on Census. In the last year, added 13 universals. Actually, a pretty significant increase when you're talking about the total Census. We added, a 0.5, a 1, a 1.8, 2.5, a bunch of 3s. I wonder if there were some resubmits in there to try to get something higher. 3.5, 2 5.5s, a 6, and a 7. So nothing like super high grade. Highest one was a 7 in the last year. But this was an increase of 7%. That's a little more like what we were seeing in the Silver Age. An increase of 7% for Detective Comics #140, that first appearance of the Riddler. But still, only 192 universal copies out there. There are more than 192 Batman fans that would love to have the first appearance of the Riddler. And that's why these books are worth so much, even in low grade. I mean, look at this, like 4.5 last sale, $10,000. A 1.5, $6,500. I mean, expensive books. All right, now the last one we're going to talk about, picked one right near the end, one of the most recognizable covers of the Golden Age, 1954, Crime Suspense Stories, number 22. This one moves like a Copper Age book. It's so in demand that this book gets graded a lot every year. Like I check back multiple years and it gets around this number of copies added kind of each year. So there's 399 universals on Census right now. I mean, next week, I wouldn't be surprised if it breaks 400. In the last year, they added 38 copies. So percentage-wise, that is an 11% increase for this book. Now, total, it's still a very small number. And so that's what you kind of have to look at with the takeaway here is total, very small number, but percentage-wise, very big increase for this book, 11%. So there are definitely, a good number of those books out there still raw that people are sending in. Now, the question is how many of these are resubs, to go for higher grades, or they don't send in the label. I mean, like, look here, we had a restored copy that was a -1. So somebody probably sent in that label and then maybe it got turned into maybe this 4.5 or this 4, or maybe it stayed a 5, who knows? But Golden Age books, let's take a look at these ones. So we've got a much different picture here than what we saw in the other eras. Total census in the tens to the hundreds. I mean, Crime Suspense Stories 22 might be the most graded Golden Age book that I can think of. Maybe there's something else out there that's been graded more, but that one is a very high census. I'm air quoting high census for a Golden Age at 399. And that's still, you're just in the hundreds there, and you're a long ways away from hitting 1,000. Even if you added 38 a year every year, it's going to take another 15 plus years to hit 1,000 copies of that on Census. And that's if that's sustainable. I don't know if it is. Maybe that just keeps going lower and lower each year. But I mean, Action Comics 1-0, Punch 12-0, Batman 1-3. And then when you're talking about percentages, these percentages are definitely lower across the board: 0, 2, 0, 7, and 11. Now, the Punch 12 that added in 1945, maybe if it had added one copy, it would have been 3%. It had 2 copies, it would have been 6. It's just, maybe it just happens to be that this year there weren't any. So that's why it's you try to average it out and, look at it that way. But at least in the last year, it was 0. Now let's look at all these together. Do a comparison of all of these so we can really see the difference between the eras. And I appreciate if you stuck through with all this with me for this video, because I know it's kind of a long video and it's numbers and not everybody likes the numbers, but I think it's very useful to kind of give you a good picture of these different eras and what you can expect on the census, what the changes might be. So if we start in the modern era, the new additions to the census, it was hundreds to the thousands. Percent increase per year, when I averaged them all, 9.4%. In the total census, thousands to tens of thousands. This is what you can kind of expect for a modern age book, 1991 to now. Copper Age, 1984 to 1991. New additions to the census, thousands. Across the board, it was thousands. Percent increase per year, 10%. And then total census, and it was actually exactly 10%, so I don't have a decimal there. Total census, all of them, for these big keys, tens of thousands. The Bronze Age, we start shifting back down again, looking more like the modern age again. Hundreds to thousands of new additions, 8.6% increase per year. And then the total census, again, thousands to tens of thousands. Now as we shift, Silver Age, 1956 to 1970, new additions, just tens to hundreds. We're not hitting the thousands anymore for new additions to the census, just tens to hundreds. And the percent increase per year dropped a little bit more, just 6.2%, a little more stable in the Silver Age. And the total census also lower, hundreds to thousands. I mean, I think maybe people don't realize how low a census some of those books are in the Silver Age, like Showcase number 4. I mean, a very low census book. Tales to Astonish 13, a very low census book for how popular those books are. And they're expensive books, so a lot of them will get graded. And last, we move to the Golden Age. You can see the new additions to census, single digits to tens, and in some cases, none. I mean, very low additions to these censuses. Now the percent increase also dropped down to 4%. I mean, so you can see like getting more and more stable as you move from the more modern-ish books, especially Copper Age, down to the Golden Age. It is interesting to me that the Copper Age is even higher than the Modern Age. That was an interesting little thing seeing there. I would have thought maybe that you'd be getting like tons and tons of bumps in the Modern Age, especially with like Ultimate Fallout 4, but it's kind of surprising. I mean, one reason this one is as high as it is that X-Men #1. That one was wild, like 17%, 17% increase there. I mean, if that one wasn't there, it'd probably be closer to what the Bronze Age is, around 8.5%. But yeah, Golden Age, just tens to hundreds on the census. You don't get to the thousands like I talked about with that Crime Suspense Stories 22. And, that percent census increase per year, 4%. Like we saw, there are outliers there. There are some that go way above. There are some that can go below. But across 5 books in each era, like 5 big popular books across that time frame. I didn't pick everything from like 1938 or 1954 or everything from 1960. Like I tried to pick across a range. That's why I didn't have multiple big Silver Age, like the #1 keys, because Fantastic Four 1, X-Men 1, Amazing Fantasy 15, like they all come out around the same time. And so I feel like it's not going to give you that real picture of what that era is like. This, I think, gives you a very good picture of these different eras and what you can expect with the census change over time. And if you use that kind of that rule of 72, rule of thumb, like Copper Age, I mean, these census, they might double every 7 years. Modern Age, around every 8 years. Bronze Age, around every 8 years. Silver Age, every 12 years. And the Golden Age would be 18 years. So you can get an idea of just the different stabilities. So hopefully this was helpful. It gives you an idea of what these different eras are like, some of the risks that are involved in those different eras based on how that census changes over time, the number of copies that are really out there. But if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe button, notification bell. Like I said, it was quite a bit of work putting together just 5 for each one. So don't give me too hard of a time. You're like, why didn't you do 10? And it's like, because I did not want to spend 10 hours putting this all together. And then you got to listen to me talk about 10 books in each year. I felt like 5 was enough. But if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe button, and I will see you on the next one.